All right, so let's talk about this big question. Does your provider's C-section rate matter? If it does matter, what's a good C-section rate? What's a concerning C-section rate? And how do we know what their answer really means? And how do we understand their answer? If you guys haven't met me before, I'm Jamie. I'm an LPN, a doula, and an IBCLC, and a mom of 4. I've had 1 C-section, 3 Vbacs. 1 was in the hospital with an epidural, 2 at home. So I have had quite a few different birth experiences. I've supported some amazing birth experiences in some amazing, strong women. And I am here to help teach you exactly how I, myself, and the moms that I work with have overcome a lot of the fears that society tells us about birth so that we can have better births. And I am so excited that you are here with me. I am so proud of you for being here and taking this first step toward having a better birth experience and really researching, educating yourself, and inspiring yourself to have a better birth. So if you are excited to keep learning more, to keep getting inspired, to have a more confident birth, and stop making decisions from a place of fear and start making decisions with information and intuition, then I am going to go ahead and invite you to hit the subscribe button below. That way you are notified every time I post a new video, which is about weekly, and you can start taking the next step toward a better birth. If you have any questions, I want you to go ahead, drop them in the comments below. I love answering questions. If you ask some really good questions, I will go ahead and feature them in my next videos. And we are going to start talking today about whether or not your provider's C-section rate matters. So a lot of times when we are interviewing providers, we are told that we should check their C-section rate, ask them about their C-section rate. But what does their C-section rate even mean? Does their C-section rate really matter? Why are we asking them that? I know I've asked doctors about their C-section rates before, and they've gotten really offended, and they're like, well, I don't know my C-section rate. Why does it matter? I only do a C-section if it's an emergency. You don't need to be asking me this. I don't keep track of that. And that kind of response is always a red flag to me. But they're kind of onto something in the sense that not all of them really do keep track of their C-section rate, and whether or not it matters, that's up for you to decide. To me, I believe their C-section rate does matter, but only if we understand it. So how do we understand their C-section rates? In order to understand your doctor's C-section rate, we need to start looking at C-section rates overall, right? So in the United States, it is 2022 right now. The last couple years have kind of made things really weird in the birth world, but the primary cesarean rate in the United States kind of hovers around 25-ish%, and the overall C-section rate hovers around 30%. So what does that mean? 25% of first C-section, or primary C-section, would be the first C-section. So not necessarily a first-time mom, but first C-sections happen to 25%. And the overall rate is 30%. So there's a 1 in 3 chance, basically, that you'll end up with a C-section. That 30%, includes repeat cesareans. Sometimes that is an emergency repeat cesarean where mom tried to have a Vbac and it ended in C-section for one reason or another. And other times it's just the fact that they didn't even offer a Vbac or didn't want to try for a Vbac, so they just scheduled a repeat C-section. So these are kind of the numbers that we're comparing with and looking at. What you should know is that the World Health Organization does have a C-section goal of around 10 to 15%. They say that above 15% on a population level, birth is not necessarily safer because of C-section. So C-section rates above 30 or above 15% are not necessarily saving more lives than if we had a 15% C-section rate. So they're estimating that about half of those C-sections might not be necessary. That is completely up for debate. That's not what we're here to talk about today. But I feel like these numbers are good reference points for this conversation. So if your doctor does know their C-section rate, and they tell it to you, these are kind of numbers that you can use as data points or goalposts. If their C-section rate is higher than these national averages, if you are a first-time mom and you've never had a C-section before and their C-section rate for primary C-sections is above 25%, you need to ask them why, and you need to understand why. Sometimes doctors are working in a setting where they primarily work with high-risk patients, so we would expect them to have a higher C-section rate. But if they're working with a mostly low-risk population or a pretty good spread, then if their C-section rate is higher, we need to start digging into that, asking why, and understanding, are most of these C-sections emergency C-sections? Are they planned? Why do you typically call for a C-section? Why do you typically recommend planning one? Do you offer Vbacs? Understanding their philosophy around Vbac can actually tell you a lot about their philosophy around birth in general. So if their C-section rate is, if you're a Vbac mom and their C-section rate is, around that 25 to 30%, you really need to ask that Vbac question. Maybe instead of, you say, okay, so I know your C-section rate. I understand why it is that, because we've talked about your population that you serve. What is your Vbac rate? How many of your patients that are eligible for Vbac, good candidates for Vbac, go on to have a Vbac? Why or why not? And this is going to tell you a lot. How they react to this question is going to tell you a lot. Even if they don't know their specific numbers, how they react, the information they divulge will tell you so much about how well they will support your labor, your birth, and your goals. Of course, if their C-section rates, are below the national averages, that's probably a pretty good indicator that they do support physiological birth a little better. It's going to depend the region you're in. Is this a big teaching hospital? Are they in a big city? Is it a rural hospital? Do they have more resources, less resources? Really digging into the whys. Finding out the C-section rate for the facility matters too. And you want to make sure that if you are talking to a doctor who is in a large practice that shares on-call schedules with the other providers, that you understand not just that provider's C-section rates and philosophies, but the rest of the providers, the practice as a whole, and the facility as a whole. Because the culture that, one great doctor is one great doctor. But one great doctor in a room of 10 not so great doctors is not so great. One great doctor in a room of 10 great doctors is amazing. So you have to really understand the culture that they're surrounded by too, because they may only have so much influence on your overall outcome. So I hope that answers your question on whether or not C-section rates matter, how to kind of understand your provider's C-section rate, more questions to ask. Don't just go in there and ask what's your C-section rate? Oh, it's that. Cool, you're great, you're bad, you suck, you're amazing, because their C-section rate may not actually reflect you and how they will work with you. Again, that being said, consider the population they serve. If they serve primarily high-risk patients and you are not high risk, they may not be the provider for you. They may be a really, really, really good surgeon, but if you are not planning for a surgical birth, you may want somebody who leans toward a more holistic physiological approach to birth. You may have a provider who is a unicorn and amazingly supportive of physiological birth and an amazing surgeon, and you have the best of both worlds, and that might be somebody you want to keep in case you do have a repeat C-section. So it's really important to consider the information that we have, the statistics that we have, what we know is kind of the standard, what we know is the gold standard, or what we really want to get to as the standard, and then understanding what your goals and values are and whether or not your provider is going to support and encourage those goals or values, or if they will be dismissive. If at any point in this conversation your provider acts dismissive, annoyed that you're asking this and trying to have this conversation, then that's a sign that they probably are not going to be the most supportive person for you if you are somebody who wants to ask a lot of questions and have a lot of conversation to make sure you are on the same page. If you found this video helpful, please go ahead and hit like to let other people know that this video can help them answer some questions. Make sure you check out some of the free resources that I do have available for you, and ask any of your questions in the comments, because I want to answer your questions. I have a lot of questions that moms ask me. I have a lot of information at my fingertips that I'm so excited to share with you guys, but I don't want to share a bunch of stuff that you don't need answers to. I want to answer your questions. So ask your questions below. I will go ahead and put them on the list to make videos about them, answer them the best I can in the comments. And I'm so excited that you're here. Go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't already, to make sure that you are getting more updates every week for more tips and inspiration for a better birth experience, how to work better with your providers, how to achieve the VBAC you're dreaming of, and how to just really lean into this transition from pregnancy to motherhood and have the best experience possible.